Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of Explicitly Pro-Life. I'm Kristan Hawkins, and joining me today for a second very special episode is Camille Pauley, the co-founder of Healing the Culture. And I've asked Camille to record this episode with me because this is something that we don't really talk about a lot in the pro-life movement, and that's the issue of assisted suicide and the issue of suffering. And this is one that I find that, college campuses, assisted suicide doesn't come up a lot, but suffering does. Every single speech I give, and if I do a Q&A, this issue of suffering comes up. And I've also been kind of concerned, when I've actually heard pro-life students, so anti-abortion students, make arguments, for why abortion is wrong. But then when I ask them about assisted suicide, they don't have an argument against assisted suicide. I've actually had anti-abortion people say that they're okay with assisted suicide because they don't see a victim in assisted suicide. They would be against euthanasia because they would see a victim there, but not against assisted suicide.
Right.
And so assisted suicide, it's coming. It's already in California, Oregon, Washington.
There's a handful of states.
There's a handful of states, yeah. and they're growing this grassroots movement. And what they do is they pass it through the state legislative assemblies, or they also do ballot initiatives. I don't know how they did it in Washington.
Ballot. Sadly. Mm-hmm.
So and they make these really compelling arguments for why assisted suicide should be legal. So I wanted to ask you, just first off, who are the victims? Are there victims in assisted suicide, and who are they?
It's a very fair question, because most of the people we survey who say that they are in favor of assisted suicide but not in favor of abortion claim there's a victim in abortion. You can see the unborn baby is an innocent, unwilling victim, whereas in assisted suicide there is no victim, right? The person can choose or not choose. You can take it or leave it. The problem is that you really can't take it or leave it. The pressure on people when they are terminally ill to commit suicide in states where it is legal is immense. And you can name right off the bat 5 different kinds of victims. First of all, there are people who are either underinsured or poor.
And this has happened in Oregon.
This has happened in Oregon. You can actually, online, you can get copies of the articles from the Oregonian, the newspaper in Oregon, when assisted suicide was first legalized. Back in the 90s, there was a case, a man named Randy Stroop and another woman named Barbara Wagner. They were both lower income. They were both on the state health plan, the Oregon health plan. Both of them had been diagnosed with terminal illnesses. And both of them, when they were given the diagnosis that they only had a certain amount of time left to live, you receive a letter from the Oregon health plan at that time that says that we won't pay for any of your care anymore, but we will pay for your assisted suicide pill if you choose that option. And both of them went to the media to talk about it, because what they said happened is that instead of it becoming a choice, the intense burden to have to choose death was so overwhelming that it caused for both of them deep depression, because they felt like what the whole world was basically telling them was, we won't do anything to protect your life or to save your life, because we've all gotten together and voted to pass a law that says that when you're this bad off, you really should kill yourself, because you're just not worth saving anymore and you're not worth protecting by law. And they said that kind of a letter is so disheartening that it probably leads a lot of people to suicide. Randy Stroop and Barbara Wagner ended up dying naturally of their underlying conditions, but they were really wonderful voices for so many people who could not speak on behalf of themselves, to say that what this really is it's a travesty of justice to our people who are already suffering. Why does this happen? When somebody is terminally ill, often what accompanies it is a lowering of the serotonin levels in the brain. And those serotonin levels are necessary for, well-being, mental, psychological well-being. And so the natural thing that happens with a diagnosis of a terminal illness and with the physiological things that are happening in your body is you're going to get depressed. And then suddenly you hear somebody lay out your options, right? Now, Mrs. Hawkins, you have 6 months of life left to live. You have your options. If you'd like, we can make you comfortable. We can take care of you. There's hospice, et cetera. You would qualify for some hospice care, Or if you prefer, assisted suicide is legal and we could give you an assisted suicide pill. You get to choose. Now, Kristan, if you are dying, you're depressed about the diagnosis, right? And you're poor. And you're on a health plan, right? And you receive this letter saying, we won't pay for your care anymore, but we will pay for your assisted suicide. And you've got, clinical, diagnosable, physiological depression. What are you going to do? For a large segment of that population, you're going to choose suicide because you're going to think that's what's expected of you. And your depression is going to lead you to think you aren't worthy of anything else. And you don't have the means to care for yourself anyway. Right? And so those become real victims. A second victim, of course, are people who are elderly. Are elderly who, are not functioning maybe at the same level they would have before. They aren't making decisions on the same level they were before. Many of them are alone in their decision making. And many of them may hear a granddaughter or even a daughter say, "Mom, I support you. It's your choice."
Which is when we hear that in the pro-life movement, when I've interviewed several girls who've chosen abortion, they'll say it was because they didn't, they naturally did not want to have the abortion, but they went and asked friends how they felt, what they should do, and they heard that. And
nobody stood up for the baby.
I'll support you in your choice. Yeah. It's your body, your choice. And when they hear that, they all said, well, that meant they wanted me to have the abortion.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happens in assisted suicide. The daughter says, "Mom, it's your choice. I'll support you in whatever you want." What does the mother hear? You don't care whether I live or die. So your elderly are real victims, right? You also have victims, people who are in pain at the end of life. And by the way, who shouldn't be. We now
There's no reason anyone should be in that level of excruciating pain.
Well, no reason. There's maybe a 1 or 2% where somebody is in so much pain at the end of life that the only way you can control the pain is to, put them into what's called a palliative slumber or a terminal slumber. And in that case, morphine drip where it would put them to sleep, but it would not kill them. There's a small fraction of percentage of people where that would happen. But for the vast majority, you're right. There's absolutely no reason why with modern palliative care, pain control, anybody should be in excruciating pain to where they would want to kill themselves. But it can happen, and it does happen.
And if you're poor and you're not getting the access to the medicine, the pain management.
That's a real problem. And you want to point this out to assisted suicide advocates and to people who are just, innocently misled. Why are we saying that the way to solve the problem of the poor who are in excruciating pain, so much excruciating pain that they want to die, why are we saying that the solution to that is to go ahead and help them kill themselves? Why aren't we saying, wait a minute, let's get them the care they need and deserve so they're not in excruciating pain so badly that they want to kill themselves?
And it's funny because all those people who argue for this pro-assisted suicide argument are also the same people who are arguing for Medicare for all. Yeah, they're also the same people arguing for socialized medicine, which is who they say everyone deserves quality health care.
Yeah. And another one of your victims, and people don't often think of these as victims, are people who are stoics. The person who's always been powerful, athletic, maybe independent. I did it my way. And they get to the end of their life, and they look at this and they say, I have to commit suicide now.
I have to take control.
I have to take control. Are they victims? You bet they absolutely are victims, because the law now is empowering the delusion that the meaning of your life is about taking control.
Or that you have control.
Or that you even have control, right?
That's something I do. I don't have control of my life. I try, but it doesn't work.
But who is presenting them with the option that, maybe because you can't have any control anymore now, maybe that leaves a door open for something much deeper, like forgiveness with the family members you've held grudges against all this time, reconciliation, introducing the idea of God, but who's gonna introduce those things to the person who is stoic, who's always lived an independent life, when the state now says it's best for you to just die, take control? And of course, the final victim, the fifth victim, the obvious one, or the person who has, malintended relatives. Hey, Mom, I heard you got this bad diagnosis and assisted suicide is legal and we'll sure be willing to help you, and stands to gain an inheritance or, whatever. That kind of pressure is there, and it's real, and it exists as well. But these are real victims, and there's a principle that we didn't discuss in the last episode we did, a principle of justice called options versus duties. And it says one person's option should never become another person's duty. What that means is you cannot claim a new option for one group of people as a legal right, for example, if it places an undue burden on a whole other group of people to die, right? Or to have some unjust burden placed on them. We should allow as many freedoms as possible, but you cannot allow a new freedom to some people if it presents a burden, an undue burden to another group of people to have to die. And that's exactly what's happened with these 5, unintended victims of assisted suicide.
It's terrible. Okay, so you've got these victims, and I think we've demonstrated there are real victims with assisted suicide. But I think the question that normally comes up, and we can hear this in the pro-life movement all the time when it comes to abortion, is the issue of suffering. Yeah. Of that this is the modern way of thinking about suffering is that suffering is an evil. Yeah. That suffering is a wrong. And that anything you can do to stop suffering, even if that means aborting a child before the child's had the chance to take its first breath outside of his mother's womb, or if that's telling someone to take a pill to end their own life, that's considered a good because you're ending the ultimate bad, which is over here, and that's suffering. What's wrong with that?
Well, fundamentally, as Christians, we do believe that suffering is bad. So we want to cure as much suffering as we can. That's what motivates us to cure the suffering. But we do not believe that it is only, always, and infinitely bad. In other words, we do believe there is good that can come out of suffering. And sometimes there is good that can only come out of suffering because of our fallen human nature. If you've ever noticed, times when you are so angry, holding a grudge against someone else that you just can't stand it and you're just seething in rage at someone else, sometimes it takes a moment of suffering. In fact, I would say most often it takes a moment of suffering for you to overcome that rage, right? Getting hurt by someone else, right? Someone hurt you and then seeing that, maybe you've hurt someone else in a similar way. It's that kind of suffering that can sometimes call us to our senses. Or maybe I'm so self-focused on my own world and my own life and my own ego, and then I stop and notice somebody else has fallen, right? Or someone else is about to get hit by a bus. It's those times when I see suffering that I tend to get called outside of myself to do a good beyond myself. So suffering from the Christian perspective always has the opportunity to bring grace, right? There's always an opportunity for love, for forgiveness, for self-sacrifice, gift of self in suffering. And when you see that, the redemptive aspect of suffering, then you can never say that there is ever such a thing as useless suffering, as unbearable, intolerable suffering. All suffering becomes tolerable and bearable to any person who can see meaning in the suffering. The problem with our culture is that people cannot see meaning in suffering because they don't understand what love is. Love is gift of self, sacrifice, and pouring out of the self for the good of the other. If they were able to see that, then they would see it's in moments of suffering that I'm often most capable of giving myself away to others, because it's when I'm suffering that I have empathy, right? That I have compassion for you because I know what it's like to suffer. That I have patience because I want you to be patient with me. And we see this playing out in hospice. We see this playing out. We had a program called Being With at one point where we would train people to go in and visit with people in nursing homes and hospitals who were either terminally ill or seriously debilitated. And it was in their moments of greatest weakness, of greatest debilitation, that these patients would reach out for help and for relationship with our volunteers. Where they otherwise wouldn't have because of their strength. But it was in their weakness that they were strong in their desire for love and friendship and in relationship. So that belief that suffering can have a redemptive value is really important to teach in the pro-life movement. If we don't, then you're going to be stuck with saying somebody is, flat on their back in a hospital bed with 6 weeks of life left to live and can no longer play tennis and is no longer competitive and, has to have drugs and whatever pumped into his body. How is that quality of life? How is that suffering meaningful? Well, it's not meaningful except in the mystery of love. Because in the mystery of love, my suffering allows me to see the other. Because of my suffering, I can now see your suffering. And I know what it's like to suffer. And it calls me to compassion and it calls me to empathy. I don't know if you heard this, but we always tell about the little story of the people with no elbows. Do you remember that one? It's a story about how God creates these people and he puts them in front of this banquet table to eat. And then, he's invisible and so they can't see him, but they try to eat, but they can't because God has apparently neglected to create them with elbows. So every time they try to, they try to get the food in their mouths and their elbows won't bend and they make a big mess. And the first group of people says God must be incredibly stupid because we have to suffer and die out of starvation because God couldn't figure out how to make elbows, right? And the second group of people says, well, that doesn't make any sense. God is all powerful and all knowing. He obviously knows how to make elbows and he's powerful enough to make elbows. The problem with God is that, he's not all loving. He's cruel and mean and angry and selfish. And he's laughing at us right now in our elbowless, gymnastics trying to get food to our mouth. And these people grew into a rage, and they started killing each other. And the third group of people said, well, that doesn't make any sense, because if God is powerful like you said he was, he would be all powerful. And if he was all powerful, he would be all loving, because love is the greatest power there is. The real answer is God does not exist. There is no God. There is no redemptive aspect to suffering. And these people resorted to suicide, right, in their depression. But the fourth group of people was eating, because they stopped thinking of themselves long enough to see the need in the eye of the other across the table. They reached out, exactly, bingo, you get the star, right? They reached out their elbowless arms across the table and began to feed each other. And they recognized that in my suffering, I can see the suffering of someone else, and it opens me up to empathy, which motivates me to a loving act. And it's there that I find my true meaning, right? That principle of beneficence we talked about before, do the good.
That's beautiful. That's great. It's so hard, because I think the argument comes from a good place on the campuses, right? Where no one wants to see anyone suffer. And so it's just this misplaced compassion we see over and over again. And not, whether you're talking about assisted suicide or you're talking about abortion. I see it more when we're talking about abortion, because my speeches deal with abortion on campuses of how can you how can you justify bringing into the world someone who will suffer? I'm a part of this CF moms group on Facebook. So there's all these Facebook groups for parents of children with cystic fibrosis or other diseases. So there's a bunch of CF groups, and I'm on this one, and it's really interesting. Sometimes I get some good tips. Most of the time I kind of see it more as a ministry to get on, because there's so many hurting people. Depression rates are very high within the CF adult community, CF teen community. They actually start screening now, I think 10 or 11 yearly for depression within CF patients, but it's also extremely high with the parents and the caregivers. And you see these moms get on just posting these just heartbreaking things. But what I also see, and then there was a little spat I entered the other day, there was a mom talking about, I don't want to have another child with cystic fibrosis. And this is a real challenge. When you find out you have a child with CF and that both you and your spouse carry this recessive gene, there is a feeling of guilt, because you have brought into life a child who will suffer, and that's because of your gene that your child will suffer. But you can't suffer.
Parent brings into the world a child who is going to suffer.
That's right.
We all do. It's just in what manner is your child going to suffer, and are you prepared to suffer with him or her?
That's it. Yeah. That's exactly it. Because that is what I find more often. It's this, I don't want to have what do I do? I think I'm pregnant. I don't want to bring in the world another child who will suffer. Mm-hmm. But the ultimate question, what they're not saying is, I don't want to have to do the suffering with you.
Exactly. It actually is, and it's hard to say this because, you certainly don't want to condemn or accuse anybody, but it is actually an act of selfishness. And I accuse myself of this. I stand at the front of the line. It is an act of selfishness to say, I don't want my child to suffer. Because it's in acts of suffering that my child will learn to be most like Christ. Mm-hmm. I don't want my child to suffer. I will throw myself in front of the bus for my child. I will do what it takes to make sure she doesn't touch the hot stove. Mm-hmm. But she is going to suffer. It is a suffering world. Mm-hmm. And so my biggest job in life is not to try to protect her in a bubble from ever getting injured or suffering. Mm-hmm. It's to prepare her for suffering well.
And how to deal with the suffering.
How to deal with the suffering and how to use it for greater good beyond yourself, right? Not sit there in a pity party. But to choose, you can choose. You will choose what to do with your suffering. You will either choose to internalize it, right? And then become angry and selfish and bitter, or you can choose to externalize your suffering and say, in my suffering, I will choose to see the suffering of others. And then I will make my life a good for others, and I will figure out what to do with my suffering. Have you ever watched these shows late at night? Have you ever watched TV at 2 a.m? And they always have these commercials at Children's Hospital, right? Or the Miracle Network or whatever.
St. Jude's.
Right? St. Jude's. And you see these little kids with cancer. And what are they all saying? Are they all saying, I wish you would end this and put me to death because the suffering is... No, they're all saying, when I grow up, I want to be a doctor and save people's lives, you know? And you just look at these kids and you're like, wow, you're suffering far more than I've ever had to. And you're thinking about others, wanting to make a difference. Why would you want to end somebody's life who's going to bring that kind of love into the world on the sole purpose that they're going to suffer like all the rest of us are, right? Don't be afraid of their suffering. And most of all, don't be afraid of your suffering that you're going to have to endure through the compassion and empathy you're called to do. You're worthy of that. That's who you're meant to be. You give up on that and you've given up on what it means to be human, which is to bear one another's burdens, suffer with each other, and turn it into moments of love.
That's right. That's exactly right. I think you've said it all. I don't know. Do we miss anything else?
I don't know. There's a lot more to be said, but I
that
don't know
was
what
like
it
a
is.
mic drop moment. I think you had it.
I didn't know.
But thank you again for coming on again on my podcast. And thank you all for tuning in to Explicitly Pro-Life. I hope this was helpful and kind of start getting the wheels turning in your mind. So next time the topic of assisted suicide comes up, and it's going to come up, especially as we head into the election year. I haven't started looking at what states will try to put this on the ballot, but we know this movement's coming. We need to be talking about the victims of assisted suicide. And we need to talk about suffering, because I think we have a lot of work to do, just from what my experience on campuses, and I'm sure your experiences on campuses are. We have a lot of work to do, and a lot of inaccuracies to correct. So thanks for tuning in to Explicitly Pro-Life. Make sure you subscribe and spread the word. Bye, guys.